Hi, hello, how are you? Craig Chapman here, and welcome to Brutally Roll Your Own Backend, a short video series on writing your own low-cost backend for a Delphi application. This is part 4. We're going to continue building our REST endpoint using PHP scripting, so let's go right ahead and get started where we left off last time. So since I recorded the previous video, I've had a couple of questions that I wanted to address real quick. The first of them was, what are the advantages and disadvantages of using Notepad versus HTML5 Builder or PHP Ed? Well, as I mentioned with the PHP Ed, and the same is true of HTML5 Builder, is you get the ability to debug your scripts as you're writing them. PHP Ed, for example, has the ability to debug locally on your development machine by installing a HTTP server and debug hubs. It also has the ability to debug remotely by installing a debug system on your remote server. You don't get that with Notepad++. The real difference is that Notepad++ was not designed to be used specifically for PHP scripting. It's a very powerful, very capable text editor, but that's all it is. It's not intended as an IDE. Now what that means, of course, is you are reduced to different means of debugging. It used to be that if you had an error in your PHP script, the error message could come out through the browser. There was a setting in most of the browsers to disable the so-called friendly error messages and instead see the actual error message coming from the script. Now, I've been unable to find this option in more recent browsers. I believe it's been removed. So if you get an error in your script, it'll just come out as a 500 server error in the browser, and you're then reduced to sending out debug messages or commenting portions of your code to find the bits that are broken. So it's a little more arduous to debug that way. The second question was, why am I using MySQLi as opposed to PDO? PDO has a slightly nicer syntax and is somewhat database agnostic, so it could be used with different database engines. And the honest reason is I've always used the MySQL or MySQLi extensions and just didn't consider researching the alternatives. And so, having said that, I went away and researched the PDO, and I like the syntax, and I like the fact that it's database agnostic. So I've decided that the first thing we should do in this video, is to replace the MySQLi driver with PDO. So let's go ahead and get started doing that right now. If we do it now, it means, in fact, I don't believe there are any changes required in the setup script, so it'll just be easier to do now rather than trying to swap it out later. So I'm going to go ahead and delete everything in this file except the connection line, just to keep those details on the screen for the moment. And I'm also going to remove this echodb.php at the bottom of the script. We don't need that anymore. Let's get rid of it. And I'm going to go ahead and comment out the connection line, and let's start putting in the PDO connection. So first thing to note is that we can use try-catch to catch errors from the PDO. So if I put in my try-catch here, the exceptions that we can expect are PDO exception. And let's give that a variable name. Okay, ooh, did that for me. Okay, I'm going to stick with con as the connection name, and this time instead of new MySQLi, it's going to be new PDO, and then I need to give it MySQL, that's the driver that we're going to be using, the host name being localhost, the database name, so we don't need to do a DB select with this driver, we just put the database name in and we'll call that notifier. And then we need to give it the username, which again was notifier, and the password, brutally roll your own. Okay, so we now have a connection using the PDO driver as opposed to the MySQLi. So let's get rid of that. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to use PDO's ability to send exceptions as its default error system. So attribute PDO, let's see, ATTR error mode PDO ERR mode exception. Okay, so what this is doing is it's setting a driver attribute on the PDO to say, you can give me exceptions as error messages. Okay, so if something should go wrong with our connection, we should echo the error message. So I'm going to say connection failed, and let's output the error message. And finally, let's kill the script if that should happen. So now, if I run the setup script, let's start by running the index here. Okay, so something has gone wrong, and we have an exception. And this is what I was saying, is we don't have any details for this error message. If I click on details, I get an option to diagnose the error, and Windows will do its best, but all it will really tell me is there was an error. So it's not particularly useful. So let's just double check this code real quick. Do you know, I don't think it will make a difference, but let's put the single quotes in here. Missed a colon there, that's the issue. Okay, so let's save that off and reload. Hello, so that all looks good. So now let's also check what happens if we put the incorrect username in, like we did with the previous driver. We're going to try and connect as Noxtifier, and we get the connection fail message, which is exactly what we expect. Okay, now there should be no changes required to our setup script in order to execute this table change. So let's give that a try. Okay, and no message. That's good news. That means that the script executed without a fail. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make a slight change to this table. I thought we'd got all of the fields we need, but I remembered after filming the previous video that we actually need to have a foreign key into our regions table, so, or rather locations table. So to explain what this is, the food truck, as you'll remember, stops at several locations, and we need to put those locations into a database so that the application can select which of those locations a particular user is registered at, and send push notifications only to those users at that location when the truck arrives. So what we're going to do here is we're going to have a foreign key, actually it's going to be an integer foreign key, into locations, and this is going to be an integer field, and it's fine, I'm fine with it being null. So okay, so let's go ahead and run that script. Still looks good. So we also need a couple more tables. I've just been mentioning the regions and locations tables. So before I put those in, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a quick change to this script. I'm going to echo creating table, and then we'll call it TBL devices. And assuming this is successful, and we can put some error traps around this later if we want to, but frankly it's a one-time script. We should run this script, and assuming it succeeds, we never really need it again. So I'm not too worried about the error conditions in this one. So I'll put in OK to say that this succeeded after the table's been created, and then we'll output the br/line break. So if I go ahead and run this, we'll see creating table devices. Okay, so that worked. Now I'm going to take a copy of that chunk of code. In fact, let's put some comments around it as well. Just to separate this in the source code devices. Okay, so I'm going to take a copy of all of this code here and insert it again, but this time I'm going to put in TBL regions. TBL regions. So regions would be the food truck's route. Typically a food truck isn't going to have a route which covers an entire city, for example. It might have the north of the city, the south of the city, and what have you. Now, I could name this table routes, but that doesn't mean as much to the end user. I'd actually prefer the end user to see the word regions, because if they live in the north of the city, it's easy for them to say, okay, I'm in the north of the city, and then from the locations, select a location on the north of the city route. So I'm going to go ahead and name this regions, just to remind us that that's what we should name it with the end user. And this is create table regions. We still want a primary key. The only field we want in this actually is going to be the region name. So we'll call it str name. And there's no reason to change the 250 at this point. I think that should be plenty. So we've got table regions. Now we're going to do the same thing again. And this time, this is going to be table locations. Now the locations table is going to look very similar to the regions table because we're just storing the name of a location that the truck is going to stop at. But what we're also going to add here is an integer FKID, so foreign key, actually FK region. Let's name it after the table, FK regions, and that's an integer. So effectively what we're saying here is we could have, so I live in the city of Austin, so we could have North Austin, South Austin, East Austin, West Austin, and the locations within that would be potentially the locations of the buildings, the locations of the stops on the route. So that's our locations table. Now the foreign key is going to say this location belongs to one of the region or one of the routes. So you won't have, say location X is in the north of Austin. You don't want location X to appear when you're selecting the south of Austin. So those are going to be our tables then. Let's go ahead and run the script. And we have table regions and table locations. Now I'm logged into my MySQL session, so I'm just going to do a select. Actually, I've got the line there, select star from devices, the device table's there. The same from locations. So we can see that there is nothing in the database at the moment. And actually, if I use describe TBL locations, then we can see the three fields that we've entered into our database there. Let's describe regions and just double check on devices. Okay, FK locations is there. So effectively, the device is going to be registered to a location. The location is going to be registered to a region. Good. So that's our setup script. Now let's get started building an endpoint. So one thing that I don't particularly want to do for this video series is get involved with the module mod read write. If you don't know what that is, basically read write lets you alter a URL. So a lot of REST services have things like this. You could say locations would be the endpoint, and then /1 would be the ID of the endpoint of the location within the locations table. Now this would require the mod read write module to read this piece of information and translate it into an appropriate call. This is not actually a fundamental requirement of REST. This is just a commonly used method. I'm not going to use that method just because of the complications added by using mod read write. But if you want this type of URL, then you can go ahead and research how to use mod read write from your PHP scripts and make the change, modify from the code that I'm writing here and make it your own. What I'm going to do instead is I'm still going to have the locations endpoint, but then I'm going to use either post or get variables or the message body to send the parameters and information back and forth. So the way that I'm going to do this without mod read write is this. Over in the public directory, I'm going to create a new directory and name it after the endpoint. So let's name this one, let's go for regions first. So I'm going to name this one regions. Okay. Now within that directory if I place a file named index.php, this is the file that's going to execute. Let's go ahead and put something in this and demonstrate. So php echo, regions, can't type straight today, and that will be the end of that script. So if I change this URL and put /regions on the end of it, I'll get regions come out. So we still get the endpoint name, we just don't get the record 1, not found. So that's how I'm going to do a sort of an endpoint system without having to involve mod read write, which just adds a little complication that we don't need at this point. Okay, so let's make this somewhat useful. I'm going to go over here and in my private directory, I'm going to create a new directory and I'm going to call it lib. So lib is where I'm going to put the libraries that the endpoints depend on. And the first file that I'm going to put into lib, create a new file, let's call it crud.php. Okay, now crud.php is just going to be a base class file. We're going to put a class in here called CRUD. So let's create that class, CRUD, and we need a few methods in here. Now this is CRUD, so I'm going to use function do read, and for the moment let's just return, So read is associated with the get method from HTTP. So I'm going to say the get method not implemented. So this is just the message that will come out if we call the base class read method. Now I'm going to take a copy of that and I'm going to reuse it 4 times. As you might have guessed, it's read, create, update, and delete. Okay, let's actually put these in the order of CRUD as well. So, create, read, update, and delete. And then we need to change the implementation method messages, because the create method is post, the read method is get, the update method is put, and the delete method is delete. So these are just the HTTP protocols available request methods, get, post, put, delete. So we're just translating those into create, read, update, and delete, as is typical for a CRUD implementation. Then what we're going to do is add another function, and let's call this get response. Okay, and we're going to put in here, so get response we're going to call when a request is made of our HTTP server. We want to generate the response to that request. There's a little bit of domain creep here because I'm actually blending the REST with the CRUD, but I don't think that's really going to affect us too much. So I'm going to go ahead and say, let's ask for the server variable request method. Okay, so that's asking for from the HTTP server which method was called. And then we're going to do a series of if statements on this. So if method equals get, very important to remember equals in PHP. Too much Delphi coding will get you out of that. And then I'm going to go ahead and hit return this, do, let's see, read for the get method. Okay, and then we're going to put an else. Actually, it's not doing else, let's just copy paste the if statement. And again, we need this 4 times, one for each of the methods. So let's call it get, post, put, and delete. And then we have, instead of do read, post would be create, do create. Put would be update, and delete would be do delete. Okay, so effectively now we have a CRUD class, and I'm just going to go ahead and collapse this up. So we have a CRUD class that will do nothing but spit out messages saying the method you've selected is not implemented. So back under regions index, if we reopen this file, let's take out this echo message, and what we want to do in here is sometimes this happens that you get a message that the file on disk is not in sync with the file that you've got open, particularly when using this NPP FTP. Not sure exactly why that happens, but I'm just going to go ahead and delete that echo again. Okay, so what we want to do here is we want to include our CRUD library. So I'm going to use a require once, and we need the path to it. So this is going to be up1. Now, looking at our relative directories, we're in the regions directory. So if we go up 1, we're now in public. Up 2, we're in the main site, and then we can come down to private. So it's up 1, up 2, private, and we're in lib crud.php. So that's going to give us our CRUD class. Then what we're going to do, we'll create a variable called CRUD equals new CRUD. Did I capitalize it? I did. Let's go ahead and CRUD. And we don't have any parameters for the constructor on this. And then what we're going to do is simply echo CRUD get response. Okay, so what should happen now is if I call regions, the index script, it will be called. It will include our CRUD class. It's going to create an instance of the CRUD class. It's then going to call get response. Get response is going to look at the calling method, and it's going to call the appropriate function, which will just return a message saying this function not implemented. So let's go ahead and run that, get not implemented. Now at this point, we should switch over, and I'm going to fire up RAD Studio on my other screen here. We should switch over to the REST debugger. So the REST debugger is available for free at embarcadero.com/free-tools/REST debugger. So you can go and download this whether you have RAD Studio or not. If you do have RAD Studio as I do, it's hidden away in the tools menu, so I'm going to go ahead and launch that and create a shortcut real quick. And this is what the tool looks like. So what we're going to do from this tool is we're going to select our URL, which is regions, and send a request, and we get back get not implemented. We can test the post method, put, and delete. So we know now that all of our methods are firing correctly. Okay, so pulling this to the side for a moment, let's go ahead and implement a subclass which makes use of some of these methods. Okay, so up under the private lib directory, I'm going to create a new file, and we're going to create, let's call it CRUD table.php. So what we're going to create here is we're going to create a somewhat generic class which will expose a database table as a CRUD class. So we'll be able to perform the CRUD operations on the database table. And we're going to start first by using require once and private and db.php. So I should explain what's happening with the path here. So CRUD table is a file in our lib directory, which is private. But when we call, or when we include this file, we're going to be including it into the index.php inside of regions. And when we create a locations endpoint, for example, we'll have an index file in there, and that also will be including CRUD table. So effectively, our root path is public/regions or public/locations or whatever the endpoint name is. So as far as the CRUD table script is concerned, it exists up here in the endpoint. So when we include this file, we need to use the same up once to region, up once to public, up again to notifier, down to private, and then use the db.php file here. So that's why the relative path is not relative to the location of the file, but relative to the location of the file which includes it. It's very important to get that correct. Okay, we're also going to use require once, and again we're going to use private. This time we're going to descend into the lib directory, and we're going to go get our crud.php file, because that has the base class that we want to extend. So now we're going to start a new class, and we'll call it CRUD table, and it extends CRUD from the it extends the previous class. Now what's going to happen with this method, with this class, is any method that we don't override will default back to the not implemented message. But any method that we do override will go ahead and perform whatever functionality we put in it. And the functionality we're going to put in it is going to be the CRUD operations on a database table. So what we need is a couple of variables. We want to know what table we're operating on, and I'm also going to put in the key field. Okay. Now the reason for the table should be obvious. This is the table that we're operating CRUD on. The reason for the key field is because pretty much all of the information that we'll send back and forth, we can just give a field name, and the database can, the class can look up the appropriate field name. But the key field, this bad typing, F field. Okay, but the key field is our CRUD class needs this to look up specific records, and we may not actually pass the key field name back and forth. There are occasions when we can't do that. So we need both of those variables. We then need to create a constructor for this class. So we name the constructor after the class itself, and I'm going to have the variable table and key field passed in, so we're injecting those parameters. And then inside the constructor, all I'm going to do is I'm going to use this, which is the equivalent of self in a Delphi script, and the table variable becomes equal to table, the parameter that we're passing in. And notice here that the level of scope is being resolved by this and this funky operator here. So that's our scope resolution operator here. So this variable is not going to clash in terms of naming. So we'll do the same thing again, and we're going to use key field equals key field. So that sets our class up with the initial required parameters. So, sorry, I'm just checking the clock, and we're bordering on the half hour, but I kind of want to keep going here. So I'm going to make this video a little longer than usual. So, okay, what we're going to do first is let's take a look at the read operation, because that's the least destructive, so we'll start on that one first. So we need a function, do read. Now we don't need any reserved words or anything to override the method on the base class. We just put the same method name in, and this will override. And if we want to, we can call the base class from within it, but we're not going to be doing that. What we're going to do instead is we're going to issue global con. So basically this is getting us the con variable from the global scope, and that is within our db.php script. Okay, and now we need to develop our SQL statement. So I'm going to do the simplest form here, select star from, and then we want our table name. So again, I can use this scope resolution table and a semicolon to end the statement, and then calling the statement stmt is equal to con prepare SQL. So we're preparing that query, and then we'll use stmt execute to execute the method. And finally, we want to get the results back, so we'll get results, and that will be from stmt, the fetch all method, and if I can remember that I'm still new to PDO, so I believe it's PDO fetch assoc. Okay, and then we want to encode that return, and we're going to encode that as JSON encode results. Okay, so what this is going to do is it's going to select everything from the table that we care about. It'll prepare and execute that statement, fetch the results, encode them as a JSON packet, and return them. So I'm going to go ahead and now modify our regions script to make use of this CRUD table file. So instead of including CRUD PHP, I'm going to go ahead and include CRUD table PHP. Let's alter this name just to be CRUD table. Okay, so we're going to create a new instance of CRUD table, and a couple of parameters need to be passed in. So we're going to pass in the table name, which in this case is table regions, TBL regions, and the key field, which is the integer PKID field. So that creates an instance of the table class for us, and then we just call table get response. And because we've overridden the read method, that should read and return the entries in our database. Now, of course, at the moment, there are no entries in our database, so let's go and create a dummy entry. So we want to insert into TBL regions, and we're going to insert just the str name field, values, and I said I'm in North Austin, so let's create North Austin. Okay, so we now have that record entered, and if we do a select star from TBL regions, we can see that North Austin's entered in there. So let's go ahead now and call the regions get method, and we have an error. Currently isn't able to handle this. So I'm going to double check the include file path. We're including CRUD table with these two parameters, and get response. I believe that looks accurate. Oh, So as you can see, a very simple single character issue can cause big problems for us debugging wise, and this is why I would recommend using a more functional IDE for this purpose. So I'm going to presume that this method is written correctly and do a quick refresh. Looks good. So if I take out the die message, now the script should return to its previous behavior, and it should return our results. Yes, here it is. So we have int PKID coming out, string name North Austin. So that's returning data from our CRUD endpoint. Let's go ahead while we're here and add one more. I think if I add one more, then we can end this video. Let's add the create method so that we actually have the ability to put records into the database and read them back. Okay, so our create method is a little more complex, but not too much. So the first thing that I'm going to do here is I'm going to get, again, a global connection. So that gets us our database connection. Now, here I want to get the data. So when we call the create method, effectively what we're going to do is pass in the message body a series of records that we want to create. So I need to get those from the message body. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get message body, and we'll just say data. And what we're going to do is JSON decode, and then we'll use file get contents. So this is going to open a file stream, file handle on the server. And if we put in php:// as the protocol and input, What that's basically going to do is open the body of the request from HTTP. That's its input text or input stream. Okay, now here we need to loop the entries and insert into database. So we're going to put, to loop the entries in the decoded JSON, we'll use a for each loop, and the for each loop is going to be on the data, and each row of that data we'll call an entry. So we'll open up a for each loop to go through that data. Now within here, what we're going to do is we want to build an insert statement, and the insert statement has two parts. So let me pull this up on the screen. So if we look at the previous insert statement, we can see that we have insert into table regions. Well, that's never going to change. The only variable here is the table name which we're passing in, so that's easy enough. But then we could pass in any number of fields and therefore any number of values. So what I want to do is build this string, which will be the field name string, and this string, which will be the values or parameters string. And then we're going to concatenate those two strings into the overall query. So I'm going to basically loop through the data that's being sent to us. Each of the entries here will have a param string, and we'll make that, just initialize that, and let's also have a field string, and we'll initialize that. Okay, so having initialized those, each of the entries in the data that we receive is going to be a row of data to be inserted, and every row has several fields. So we're going to want to loop through the entry. So I'm going to use a for each through the entry. And we're going to do that as a key value pair. So that should be, the key would be our field name, the value would be the value of the data. Okay. Now, because we're in a for each loop, we don't have a control variable. So basically what we're going to do is we're going to comma separate all of these fields. We don't have a control variable to do that, so I'm going to go ahead and use, let's say, first equals true. So the first loop through will have this first variable. So what we'll do is we'll say if first, if this is the first entry, then field str. I think you can use this operator for concatenating a string to itself, and then we want to concatenate the key, which is the field name. And again, if we do param str concatenate equals, and this time I want a parameter name key. So what we're doing here is in the let me go ahead and pull up the statement again, show what we're doing here. So rather than passing the value here, what we're passing in is str name with a colon at the beginning. So that's a parameter, and later we'll build an array of the parameter values and bind those values to the parameters in our statement. So that's what I'm building here. Okay, and then we're going to do else. Actually, we need to alter the first variable in here. So once we've set the first value, we're going to say first equals false, and then in any subsequent iteration of this loop, we're going to do pretty much the same thing. So let's just copy paste that. But instead, what we're going to do is we're going to pass in comma key. So we're building a comma separated list. The first entry doesn't need a prefixed comma, but every subsequent entry does. So that's building up our list of fields right there. Okay, now let's build into SQL statement, and we'll create a variable SQL, and we'll have insert into, this table and then we're going to open the brackets, and it's going to be the field struct. So this is the comma separated list of fields, values, and then we're going to include in param struct, comma separated list of parameter names, and then we'll close the statement. Okay, so having built our SQL statement, we need to prepare it. Oops. And so we're going to have stmt is equal to the connection called the prepare method, and pass in our SQL string. Okay, having prepared that, we now need to bind the parameters. So for each of these colon, key name, we need to pass in the actual value that we've been given to insert. And we're going to do that by entering another for loop. So we're going to do another for each, and we'll go through each entry again. So each of the objects in entry, which are the fields. And again, this is going to be as key value pairs. And all we need to do in here really is stmt, so the statement called the bind value method, and we're going to bind colon key, so that will be the name of the parameter to its value. Now, I should probably explain before we go any further why I'm doing the binding this way. Why wouldn't I just include the values in the param string as I'm building it up? And the answer is, if we bind the values as I'm doing here after preparing the SQL statement, this statement class is aware of the data type of each of the fields in the database that we're preparing against. So when I insert this value, it knows whether or not it should expect an integer or a string or a date or what have you. Now, if I didn't do that, then I would somehow have to detect from the incoming data whether or not the value was a string or an integer or what its data type was, which becomes very, very complicated because in typical JSON packets, values are surrounded by quotes, whether they're strings or not, or can be. It's kind of a, I don't believe there's a particular standard for it, but they can be. As you can see here, we've got quotes around an Austin and quotes around this integer. And this piece of text here was created from the JSON encode method within PHP. So there's no way to know if this is an integer or not without doing checks to say, does it have nothing but integer characters in it? And even if that's true, who's to say that we're not entering just numbers as a name, as one of the region names or location names? It becomes kind of tricky to figure out. So what we're doing here is we're saying, well, the database knows what data types to expect. So if we pass in each of the key names as a parameter and then prepare the statement, it knows what data type to expect for each parameter, and we can then just pass in the value that we got from the JSON input. It'll figure the rest out for us. Okay, so moving on. Don't want to take up too much more of your time here. Let's go ahead and execute this statement. Execute statement, which we can do with stmt execute. So that's going to send the data into the database. Now, when that data has been inserted into the database, what I really want to do here, and I'm going to go up here and I'm going to create a new variable global to this method. So I'm going to create inserted is an array. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to record the ID of each of the records that we insert. And the way we do that is we say to statement, or rather we say to the inserted array is equal to, not the statement, the connection, last insert ID. I think that's the right method. Okay, so what that's going to do is get the ID of the last record that we inserted. So we're building up an array of inserted records here, and let's just check the braces. I really dislike working with braces, but okay. So this would be the closing brace of the main for loop. So outside of this for loop, we're basically going to do a select again, and we're going to grab back the records that we just inserted. So fetch rows that were inserted. So we'll create a SQL statement, and we'll do a select star from, and again we need to put in this table. This is going to get a little bit lengthy, so let's break this out over several lines. Okay, and we want to select where. Now this is where we need the name of the key field. Notice that last inserted ID knows which field is the key field, but we didn't necessarily get the key field passed into us from the client. So this is why we have this key field to get the key field name. Okay, and then we want in, and we need, let's implode. So implode is a function which builds a comma separated list inserted from an array. Now we couldn't do that previously up here where we were building a comma separated list, and I used first because we were only extracting the keys. We didn't want a comma separated list including the values, so I did it the hard and manual way up there. But down here we can get away with using implode. So that should give us select star from this table where key field in and the array of keys that we added. So then we want stm statement is equal to the connection, prepare the SQL query. Then we're going to call statement execute to execute that method, and just as we did before in the read method, we're going to go ahead and get results is stmt fetch all and pdo fetch associated. Okay, and then we'll call return JSON encode, and we'll put in results. Okay, so what should happen if I haven't typoed in this method is we'll call the create method and we'll pass in some data. We decode that data from the input stream, we loop through it building the SQL statement to insert that record, and bear in mind we're going to do this for each entry, so it's going to be several insert statements. Yes, several insert statements, and then we're going to prepare the SQL each time around, and we're going to loop through and bind the parameters that we got from our JSON data, execute the inserts, capture the IDs, and then we're going to perform a query to return all records for which an ID was captured. So let's go ahead and give that a try. This might be a bit of a drum roll moment. Now I'm going to pull up the REST debugger and just double check. Post is our create method, yes. So I need to set the content type here to application JSON, and then I'm able to put in a custom body. Now, since we're operating on the regions table, let's go ahead and take a copy of actually all of this and paste it in. So what this would do is it says we're going to create the same record. Actually, I don't like using int pkid because it's going to generate that for us. So we just want the name of the entry that we're going to create. So that would be insert North Austin. Well, we've already got a North Austin, so let's create a South Austin. And let's copy this and create an East and a West Austin as well. Okay, so this is going to create, we're calling the post method, which is create 3 records and insert the value for the name of each of those records to be South, East, and West Austin. Drum roll please. And we got an internal server error, so time to do more of that debugging. Another semicolon missing. That's what happens when you copy paste. And there we go. Okay, so sorry about the brief delay there. We are now at a point where we have inserted these 3 rows, and the method has collected the IDs of those as they've been inserted and spat back out the records that were inserted into the database. So if I go ahead and run the select statement that we have on regions, we now have North, South, East, and West Austin. Okay, so more than over our time on this session. I typically want to keep them to half an hour, but this one just had a bit more involved coding. So join me next time when we will build the other 2 REST methods for our reusable endpoint. Until then, my name is Craig Chapman. Thanks for watching.